You don't need thicker skin. You need a disciplined nervous system. Because the truth is this, nothing outside you has power unless your mind gives it permission. Every reaction you have is trained. Every trigger you feel is learned. And what's learned can be unlearned. This audiobook is not about motivation. It's about control. Control of attention, control of emotion, control of response. When you master this, criticism becomes noise, disrespect becomes irrelevant, and chaos loses access to you. This is the science of staying unbothered, and once you understand it, nothing touches you again. You were not born reactive. You were trained. That's the first truth you must accept if you want control. Your brain does not choose what is right. Your brain repeats what is familiar. And if you have practiced reacting, snapping back, defending yourself, explaining too much, feeling offended, feeling rushed, then your nervous system has learned one thing very well. React first, think later. That's not a personality trait. That's conditioning. You have a choice, but only if you understand how the training happened. As a child, reacting got attention. Crying brought comfort. Anger created control. Loud emotions were rewarded with response. So the brain learned a simple equation. Emotion equals power. Then school reinforced it. Speak quickly. Answer immediately. Raise your hand fast. Don't pause too long or you look weak. Then adulthood finished the job. Notifications, deadlines, social media outrage, instant replies, instant opinions, instant validation. The world trained you to be fast, not precise, not calm, just fast. And speed without discipline is weakness. That's the key. Every time you react instantly, your nervous system wires urgency. Every time you pause, it wires control. But most people never pause. They fire back texts, they argue online, they defend their image, they explain themselves to people who never asked with respect. And then they wonder why they feel exhausted, why their mind never rests, why they feel constantly on edge. It's not stress, it's training. You don't need their permission to slow down. You don't need approval to pause. You don't need to earn the right to think. You have a choice. Here's what science confirms, but discipline proves. The brain strengthens what you repeat under emotion. Reacting quickly wires impulsivity. Pausing wires authority. That's not motivation, that's biology. Your nervous system does not know right or wrong. It only knows familiar. So if chaos feels familiar, you will recreate it. If urgency feels normal, you will live rushed. If reaction feels automatic, control will feel uncomfortable at first. That's why most people quit, because discipline feels unnatural to an undisciplined system. But hear this clearly. Discomfort is not danger, it's rewiring. You were trained to react. Now you will train yourself to pause. That pause is the most powerful weapon you own, because in that pause, you break the pattern. The insult comes. Pause. The message triggers you. Pause. The disrespect shows up. Pause. You are not suppressing emotion. You are interrupting conditioning. That's the difference. Suppression is weakness. Control is strength. And control starts with noticing speed. Fast reactions are not confidence. They are reflex. Slow responses are not fear. They are command. You have a choice. Right now, your nervous system believes that reacting keeps you safe, that if you don't respond, you lose control, that if you stay silent, you lose status. That belief is false. Silence does not reduce power, it concentrates it. Think about the most dominant people you've encountered. They don't rush words, they don't explain emotions, they don't argue with chaos. They observe, they wait, they choose. Because they trained themselves differently. Here is the instruction. Simple, not easy. For the next 7 days, you will practice delayed response. Not avoidance, not weakness, delay. When emotion spikes, count 5 slow breaths before speaking. When triggered digitally, wait 1 hour before replying. When challenged publicly, say less, not more. You have a choice. This delay will feel uncomfortable. Your body will want release. Your mind will demand expression. That's the habit trying to survive. Don't fight it. Outlast it. Every time you pause and don't react, you send a new signal. I am in control. That's the key. You are not trying to be calm. You are training calm. And training requires repetition under pressure. Most people only practice calm when life is easy. That's why they collapse when life isn't. You will practice calm inside the trigger, because power is built where resistance exists. It's not about anger, it's about discipline. It's not about emotion, it's about regulation. It's not about proving strength, it's about embodying it. You don't need their permission to stay unbothered. You don't need agreement to slow down. You don't need validation to be composed. You have a choice. And every choice trains the next reaction. Right now, your reactions are automatic because you practiced them unconsciously. From this chapter forward, you practice consciously. Pause before you speak. Breathe before you respond. Observe before you engage. You were trained to react. Now you will train yourself to pause. That pause is where the old you ends. Because once you control reaction speed, you unlock the next level of mastery. You've begun breaking the habit. Now you must protect your attention, because what you focus on is what controls you. Nothing triggers you by accident. That's the truth most people avoid. If something can pull an emotional reaction out of you, it has found a weak point, not in your character, but in your discipline. You have a choice, but first you must see triggers correctly. Most people think triggers are caused by other people, by disrespect, by tone, by unfairness, by words. That's wrong. Triggers are not created externally, they are exposed internally. That's the key. A trigger is simply a signal. It points to an area where your nervous system has not been trained yet. If someone's opinion shakes you, identity is weak. If criticism ruins your mood, ego is undisciplined. If disrespect makes you explode, emotional control is untrained. It's not about them, it's about discipline. You don't need their permission to be calm. You don't need them to change for you to grow. You have a choice. Strong people don't pretend they aren't triggered. They study what triggers them. Because triggers are data. Every emotional spike is information telling you exactly where to train next. But weak minds do the opposite. They blame, they justify, they explain why their reaction was normal. Normal is not powerful. Normal is reactive. You are not here to be normal. You are here to be unbothered. Let's break this down clearly. A trigger follows a pattern. An external event occurs. Your body reacts instantly. Your mind creates a story to justify the reaction. Most people think step 3 caused step 2. It didn't. The body reacted before the story. That's the science. The story is just the excuse. That was disrespectful. They crossed a line. Anyone would react. That's not truth. That's conditioning defending itself. That's the key. You have a choice, but only after awareness. When something triggers you, ask one question instead of reacting. What part of me is still undisciplined? Not, why are they like this? Not, why does this always happen to me? Those questions keep you weak. This question makes you dangerous, in a calm way. Because once you see the pattern, you can train it. Here are the most common trigger categories. First, ego triggers. You feel disrespected, ignored, challenged. Why? Because identity is tied to external validation. That's not confidence, that's dependency. It's not about pride, it's about discipline. Second, control triggers. Plans change. People act unpredictably. Things don't go your way. Anger shows up. Why? Because the mind is addicted to control. But control of people is impossible. Control of self is mastery. You have a choice. Third, comparison triggers. Someone succeeds. Someone gets attention. Someone advances faster. Envy appears. Why? Because focus is external instead of internal. It's not about them winning. It's about you watching. That's the key. Triggers don't mean you're broken. They mean you've located a training zone. The problem is most people train avoidance instead of mastery. They avoid people. They avoid situations. They avoid discomfort. Avoidance feels safe, but it keeps the nervous system fragile. Strength comes from exposure with control. Here's the instruction. Do not eliminate triggers, use them. When a trigger appears, do 3 things. First, pause. You were trained to react. Now you pause. Second, label. Say internally, this is an ego trigger. This is a control trigger. This is a validation trigger. Labeling creates distance. That's the key. Third, choose discipline over release. You don't need to express every emotion. You don't need to prove awareness. You don't need to correct every disrespect. You have a choice. Every time you don't react, the trigger weakens. Every time you explode, it strengthens. That's neuroscience, not philosophy. Your nervous system learns from outcomes, not intentions. Say that again clearly. Your nervous system learns from outcomes, not intentions. Good intentions don't rewire habits. Behavior does. This is why staying unbothered feels powerful, not because you feel nothing, but because you feel it and still choose control. It's not about suppressing emotion. It's about delaying expression until you decide. Delay is discipline, and discipline creates authority. People feel it when you're untriggerable. They sense it without explanation, because nothing unsettles others like someone who doesn't react. That's why emotional people try harder. They provoke more. They escalate. They are searching for access. Don't give it. You don't need their permission to stay composed. You don't need them to understand to be calm. You have a choice. Here's a reality most people won't accept. If someone can trigger you repeatedly, they control you emotionally. Not because they're powerful, but because your discipline is incomplete. That's not an insult, that's an invitation, because what can be trained can be mastered. Triggers are temporary. Discipline is permanent. Your goal is not to become emotionless. Your goal is to become unavailable to manipulation, and manipulation always enters through emotion. That's the key. From today forward, you stop asking, how do I stop feeling triggered? And start asking, how do I train discipline where this trigger exists? That shift changes everything. You are not fragile. You are unfinished, and unfinished things can be built. You've learned that triggers expose weakness, not worth. Now it's time to understand why the body reacts before the mind and how to take control at that level. You identified the trigger. Next, you master the system beneath it.
You don't react because you chose to. You react because your body decided first. That's the truth most people never learn. By the time your mind starts explaining, justifying, or regretting, the decision has already been made. That's the key. Your nervous system always moves faster than thought, milliseconds faster. So if you were trying to think your way into calm while your body is already tense, elevated, and alert, you are late. You have a choice, but only if you understand where control actually begins. Most people believe discipline is mental. They believe strength comes from willpower. They believe calm comes from positive thinking. That belief keeps them reactive, because the nervous system does not respond to logic. It responds to signals of safety or threat. And most people live in a constant low-level state of threat. Deadlines, noise, conflict, comparison, uncertainty. The body stays tight. Breathing becomes shallow. Jaw clenches. Shoulders rise. Then a small comment lands. A look, a message, a tone, and the system fires. Heart rate spikes. Muscles tense. Voice sharpens. Reaction. Only after that does the mind step in and say, I shouldn't have said that. They made me angry. I was just being honest. No, your body was already activated. That's the key. You have a choice, but not at the moment you think you do. Control does not begin in thought. It begins in physiology. If the body is unregulated, the mind becomes a servant to emotion. Say it clearly. A dysregulated body produces a reactive mind. This is why smart people still lose control, why intelligent professionals explode, why self-aware people still get triggered. Awareness without regulation is useless. You don't need more insight. You need more control over your nervous system, and that control is trainable. Your nervous system has two primary modes. One prepares you to survive. The other prepares you to think. You cannot be in both at once. When the survival system is active, clarity shuts down. Language narrows, vision tightens, options disappear. You feel right, but you are not precise. That's why arguments escalate. That's why reactions feel justified in the moment. That's why regret follows later. It's not about anger. It's about activation. You have a choice, but the choice is not, should I react? The real choice is, will I regulate first? That's the discipline. Here is the uncomfortable truth. If you cannot control your breath, you cannot control your behavior. Breath is the remote control to your nervous system. Fast, shallow breathing tells the body there is danger. Slow, deep breathing tells the body we are safe. The body believes breath more than words. That's the key. You don't need their permission to slow your breath. You don't need approval to regulate. You don't need silence from the world to create calm inside. You have a choice. Most people wait for life to calm down so they can relax. Disciplined people relax first, then life follows. Here's the instruction. When emotion rises, do not speak, do not explain, do not act. First, regulate. Inhale through the nose slowly. Exhale longer than you inhale. Drop your shoulders. Unclench your jaw. This is not relaxation. This is command. You are telling the body, I am not in danger. Once the body believes that, the mind comes back online. That's when choice appears. Before that, there is no choice, only reflex. Say it again. No regulation, no choice. This is why staying unbothered feels unnatural at first, because your body is addicted to activation. Stress feels familiar, urgency feels normal, tension feels productive. So when you slow down, the system resists. That resistance is not weakness, it's withdrawal. You were trained to stay activated. Caffeine, noise, speed, pressure. You were trained to live on. Now you will train yourself to be available but not activated. That's power. It's not about being passive, it's about being deliberate. Here's what most people get wrong. They think calm means soft. They think regulation means surrender. They think slowing down means losing edge. Wrong. Calm is precision. Regulation is leverage. Slowness is control. Look at surgeons, pilots, commanders. High stakes demand calm bodies, not emotional ones. The louder the chaos, the quieter the professional. That's the standard. You have a choice. Every trigger you experience is an invitation to regulate, not to react, not to explain. Regulate first. And here's the repetition you must internalize. It's not about anger, it's about discipline. It's not about emotion, it's about nervous system control. It's not about what they said, it's about how prepared your body was when they said it. That's the key. If your body is always tense, life will always feel aggressive. So you train daily, not only during conflict. Morning breathing, stillness practice, slower movement,
intentional pauses. These are not wellness habits, they are dominance habits, because a regulated nervous system cannot be rushed, provoked, or manipulated easily. People feel it, they sense it. Your presence changes before your words do. And when the moment comes, the insult, the pressure, the test, you don't rise emotionally. You remain stable. That stability is not accidental, it's trained. You were trained to react. Now you train to regulate. And once the body obeys, the mind becomes sharp again. You have mastered the body's vote. Now it's time to understand the behavior that scares emotional people the most. Because once you stop reacting, silence becomes your most powerful tool. You regulated the system, now you control the signal.
Silence is not empty. Silence is loaded. Most people fear silence because it removes their defenses. When you stop talking, you stop leaking information. When you stop reacting, you stop feeding emotion. When you stay silent, you force others to reveal themselves. That's the key. Silence is not weakness. Silence is restraint. And restraint is intelligence under control. You have a choice. Most people talk to relieve pressure. They speak to discharge emotion. They explain to feel safe. That's not communication. That's emotional release. And emotional release makes you predictable. Predictability is exploitable. That's why silence feels uncomfortable at first, because it denies the nervous system its usual escape. You were trained to fill gaps, to respond quickly, to justify yourself. Now you will train yourself to hold space without reaction. You don't need their permission to be quiet. You don't need validation to pause. You don't need to prove awareness out loud. You have a choice. Silence does three powerful things at once. First, it regulates you. When you stop speaking, breathing slows, muscles soften, the nervous system stabilizes. Silence creates internal order. That's the key. Second, silence unsettles emotional people. People who operate emotionally expect reaction. They expect defense. They expect explanation. When you give them nothing, they lose leverage. They talk more. They reveal intention. They escalate without opposition. Silence removes the mirror they need. Third, silence signals authority. People with low status rush to speak. People with power choose when to speak. This is not arrogance. This is hierarchy. Those who speak last are often the ones deciding. You have a choice. But here's the discipline most people avoid. Silence must be intentional. Passive silence is fear. Intentional silence is control. There is a difference. Passive silence shrinks. Intentional silence holds ground. So how do you practice it? You don't disappear. You don't withdraw. You remain present but unreactive. Eye contact steady, posture relaxed, breathing slow. This tells the nervous system, I am not threatened, and it tells the other person, you don't control me. That's the key. Here's where most people break. They fear being misunderstood. They think, if I don't explain, they'll think I'm wrong. If I don't respond, I'll lose respect. If I don't defend myself, I'll look weak. That belief is false. Over-explaining reduces respect. Defending constantly signals insecurity. Reacting emotionally gives away authority. You don't need their permission to be understood. You need discipline to be composed. You have a choice. Silence is not about winning arguments, it's about ending them. Arguments require two emotional participants. When one withdraws emotionally, the game collapses. That's why silence feels powerful. Not loud power, quiet power, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Here's the instruction. The next time you feel the urge to explain, pause. Ask yourself, is this explanation necessary or is it emotional? Most explanations are emotional. They are attempts to be seen, validated, or justified. Let go of that need. Say less, mean more. That's the key. Use silence especially when you feel provoked, feel misunderstood, feel rushed to answer, feel emotionally charged. These are moments where silence does the most work. You have a choice. And remember this clearly. Silence is not permanent, it is timing. You speak when your words are clean. You respond when emotion has left the body. Then your words land heavier. One sentence said calmly after silence carries more weight than 10 said emotionally. People listen differently because silence creates contrast, and contrast creates authority. This is why powerful people pause before speaking, not to think harder, but to control impact. They don't rush truth, they release it deliberately. It's not about being mysterious, it's about being precise. You were trained to react. Now you train to withhold. Withholding reaction is not suppression, it's strategy. That's the key. Silence also protects energy. Every argument costs attention, every explanation drains focus, every reaction taxes the nervous system. Silence preserves resources, and what you preserve, you can invest elsewhere, in growth, in execution, in building something real. You don't need their permission to conserve energy. You don't need applause to stay composed. You have a choice. Here's a final truth for this chapter. If someone needs you to react to feel powerful, your silence defeats them without conflict. And if someone respects you more when you stay calm, your silence builds leadership. Either way, you win. You have learned to regulate the body. Now you have learned to control expression. Next, we remove the emotional cost that keeps people trapped in reaction, the ego. Because as long as ego needs defense, silence will feel threatening. You've mastered restraint. Now let's dismantle the thing that demands reaction.
Because explanations are not about an invitation to question, they are about protection, to debate, to protection of image, and not everyone deserves that access. Protection of identity. You have a choice. That's the key. Most people explain the ego is not who
someone
you are.
Raises an eyebrow.
It is the story.
Someone sounds
defend.
disappointed,
and
someone
every time that story feels threatened,
and immediately
the body
the
reacts.
explanation comes out.
You have a choice.
I didn't mean it like
but
that.
First,
I was just trying to
see ego.
What
clearly.
I meant was, if
ego
it's automatic,
is not confidence.
it's not powerful.
Ego is fragility.
Powerful
wearing
people
armor.
don't rush to be understood
Confidence
by everyone.
doesn't need defense.
They let understanding
Ego does.
be earned.
When someone
Let's
challenges
define
you and emotion
qualification.
spikes, ask yourself
Qualified
one
people
question.
share responsibility.
What am I trying to
They show
protect?
consistency.
Status?
They handle
Respect?
information with
Being
care.
right? Being
Unqualified
seen as
people
intelligent?
react emotionally.
That question
They
reveals
twist context.
everything.
They collect
Most people
explanations
never
as
ask it.
ammunition.
They react instead.
That's the key.
They raise
Every
their voice.
time you
They
explain
explain
yourself
harder.
to an
They
unqualified
justify.
person,
They argue.
you give them leverage.
Not because they are
you
strong,
give them context
but because their
they can
identity
distort.
feels
Intent
exposed.
they can question.
That's the
Emotion
key.
they can exploit.
Ego
And then
reacts
you wonder
fast.
why conversations
Discipline
feel
moves slow.
exhausting. It's
You don't
because
need
you're
their permission to
over-investing
let
in the
go
wrong
of ego.
audience.
You don't need
You have a
approval
choice.
to stay grounded.
Think about the
You
workplace.
have a choice.
When a leader
Here's the
over-explains
uncomfortable truth.
decisions to people who
If
don't
someone
carry
can
the
offend
weight
you,
of those
they
decisions,
have access
authority
to your ego.
erodes.
If someone
Not
can
because
insult
transparency
you, your
is bad,
identity
but
is
because
externally
explanation
anchored.
without
That
responsibility
doesn't make you
creates
weak. It
entitlement.
makes you unfinished.
People start believing
And
they
unfinished
deserve
things can be
influence
trained.
without accountability.
Ego
That's
is built
dangerous.
early.
You don't
As
need
children,
their permission
approval
to decide.
meant safety.
That's
Praise
the key.
meant belonging.
Strong leaders
Criticism
explain
felt
up
like
and
danger.
across to those
So
who
the nervous
share
system
consequence.
learns, protect
They don't
image to
explain
survive.
down to manage
That
emotions.
belief followed
they
you into
communicate
adulthood.
outcomes. They
Now,
set
criticism
expectations.
feels personal.
They move forward.
Disagreement feels like
Explanation
disrespect.
is not the same
Correction
as
feels like
communication.
attack. But
In
none of those are
relationships,
true
the pattern
threats.
is even
They
clearer.
only feel threatening
Unqualified
because ego
people
hasn't been
demand
disciplined.
explanations.
That's
They
the
say
key.
things like, "Why are you being
Strong
distant?
people are not
Why didn't you
ego
reply?
less.
What
They are
changed?"
ego light.
But notice,
They don't
they're
need
not
to be
asking
right.
to
They
understand.
need to be
They're
effective.
asking to regain
They don't need
access.
to win conversations.
That's the key.
They need to win
The moment you
outcomes.
explain,
They
you
don't need
validate the
validation.
demand.
They
You
need
accept
progress.
the premise that you
You
owe
have
them
a choice.
access. You don't.
Here's how ego
You have a
hijacks
choice.
reaction.
Here's the
Someone
uncomfortable
challenges
truth.
your idea.
If someone
Ego
reacts
hears,
badly to
you're
your boundary,
incompetent.
they were
Someone
benefiting
ignores
from
you.
the absence
Ego
of one.
hears, you don't
Explanation
matter.
won't fix that.
Someone
it will only
disagrees.
prolong it.
Ego hears,
If it's
you're
automatic,
losing status.
it's not powerful.
Then reaction fires.
Now let's talk about
Not because the
justification.
situation is dangerous,
Justification
but because the
is
story
explanation's
feels threatened.
weaker cousin.
That's the key.
It sounds like reasoning,
The
but
mind
it's
is
actually
not protecting
self-defense.
truth. It is
I had a long
protecting
day.
identity.
I was busy.
An identity
I didn't
that
mean to
needs
upset
defense
you.
owns you.
These phrases don't
Say it
resolve
again
anything.
clearly.
They
An
teach
identity
people that
that
pressure
needs
works,
defense
that if they
controls
push,
your
you'll
behavior.
explain.
This
That's
is why
the key.
silence feels
From now
threatening
on,
to ego.
your explanations
Silence
are conditional.
removes the chance
They
to
require
correct
trust.
perception,
They
to
require
manage
maturity.
image, to
They
explain
require
yourself.
respect.
Ego
If
hates
someone
that.
doesn't meet those
Discipline
standards,
welcomes
they
it.
get simplicity.
Because discipline does
not
not
rudeness,
rely on
not
opinion.
aggression.
You don't
Simplicity.
need their permission
Short
to be
statements,
misunderstood
clear boundaries,
temporarily.
no
You don't
emotional
need
footnotes.
immediate clarity
You
to
don't
stay
need
composed.
their permission to be
You
brief.
have a choice.
Here's the behavioral
Here's the practice.
discipline. When someone
next time
questions
ego
your choice,
rises,
pause.
don't suppress it.
Ask yourself,
Observe it.
is this person
Notice the
responsible
urge to
for this
interrupt,
outcome?
the urge
Do they
to
act
correct,
in good
the
faith?
urge to
Will
prove.
this explanation
That
improve
urge
the
is ego
situation
asking
or
for
just
relief.
soothe them?
Don't give
If
it
the
relief.
answer is no,
Delay.
stop.
Say
That's the key.
internally, this
Silence
is ego,
or simplicity
not
is
danger.
often the correct
That
response.
label creates
I've
distance.
decided. This
That's the
works for
key.
me. I'm not
Then
discussing
choose
this
response
further.
based
No
on outcome,
elaboration.
not emotion.
Not because you can't
Ask
explain.
yourself, does
because you
reacting
don't need
improve
to.
my position?
If it's
Does
automatic,
explaining
it's not
increase
powerful.
respect? Does defending
Notice what
move
happens
me
next.
forward?
Unqualified
Most of the time,
people
the answer
escalate.
is no.
They guilt.
So you
they
stay
accuse.
quiet.
They
Or
dramatize.
you respond briefly.
That
or you
escalation is
disengage.
confirmation.
Not because you
Qualified
lost,
people
but because
respect
ego
clarity.
didn't deserve
They
the
may
steering
disagree,
wheel.
but they
You
don't
have a
demand
choice.
emotional access.
Here's another truth
You
most
have a
people
choice.
miss.
Most
Ego
people are
grows
afraid
louder
of being
when purpose is
misunderstood,
unclear.
but being
When you
misunderstood
don't know
by the
where
wrong
you're going,
people is
you
not a
protect where you
problem.
stand.
It's a filter.
When your mission is
and
clear,
filters protect
opinions
energy.
lose weight.
As you
That's
stop
the key.
explaining, your presence
People
changes.
who build something
you
real
become harder
don't
to
argue
manipulate,
much. They're
harder
too
to
focused.
provoke, harder
Ego
to drain.
shrinks when attention
Your words
moves
carry
forward.
weight because
So
there are
shift
fewer of them.
attention.
That's the
From
key.
image to execution,
You've learned to
from
pause.
perception
You've
to
learned
progress,
to use
from
silence.
reaction
You've
to
learned to
results.
withhold
It's
explanation.
not about pride.
Now it's time
about
to
discipline.
understand where all
It's
of
not
this
about being
truly
respected.
originates.
It's about
not
being
in mindset,
unshakable.
not in willpower,
You don't need
but
their
in your
permission to let
biology.
results
Because
speak.
control
You don't
starts
need approval
in the body.
to move silently. You have a choice. Here's the final discipline for this chapter. Let ego speak internally, but never let it decide behavior. Ego can exist, it just can't lead. You lead with calm, with regulation, with silence when needed. That's power. You've removed ego from the driver's seat. Now we address the strategic advantage that comes next, emotional distance. Because once ego loosens, detachment becomes possible. You learned to stop defending identity. Now you learn to step back and see clearly. Detachment is misunderstood. Most people hear the word and think of indifference, coldness, emotional distance that feels empty. That's not detachment. That's avoidance. Real detachment is not about feeling less. It's about being controlled less. That's the key. Detachment is the ability to stay connected to reality without being owned by emotion. You still care, you still observe, you still engage, but emotion no longer dictates behavior. You have a choice. Most people confuse attachment with loyalty. They think reacting proves investment. They believe emotional intensity equals commitment. That belief keeps them reactive. Because attachment says, if this goes wrong, I lose something. Detachment says, if this goes wrong, I adapt. That's power. You don't need their permission to detach emotionally. You don't need approval to step back and see clearly. You have a choice. Here's the truth. Attachment amplifies emotion. Detachment restores perspective. When you are attached to outcomes, words hurt more. When you are attached to opinions, criticism hits deeper. When you are attached to control, uncertainty creates anger. It's not about caring too much, it's about caring without discipline. That's the key. Strategic detachment does three things immediately. First, it slows reaction. When you detach, you stop personalizing events. You stop making everything about you. That alone reduces emotional spikes. Second, it improves decision-making. Emotion narrows options. Distance expands them. Detached people see patterns emotional people miss. Third, it increases respect. People trust those who don't panic, who don't chase, who don't beg for outcomes. Detachment communicates stability. You have a choice. But detachment requires one difficult shift. You must release the illusion of control. Most reactions come from trying to control outcomes that were never yours. How people feel, how they behave, how they interpret you. You cannot control these things. Trying to control them creates emotional debt. Detachment clears that debt. That's the key. Here's where people resist. They think, if I detach, I'll lose motivation. If I detach, I'll stop caring. If I detach, I'll become passive. Wrong. Detachment doesn't remove effort. It removes desperation. Detached people still work hard. They just don't emotionally collapse when outcomes shift. They play the long game. You have a choice. Here's the practical discipline. When you feel emotionally pulled, ask this question. What outcome am I gripping too tightly? Recognition, approval, success on a timeline, control over someone else's behavior. That grip is attachment. Now loosen it. Not by quitting, but by accepting uncertainty. Say internally, I will act, I will not cling. That's the key. Detachment is not withdrawal, it's flexibility. Rigid minds break under pressure. Flexible minds adjust and win. Look at high-level performers. They don't celebrate too high, they don't crash too low. Why? Because their identity is not attached to single moments. They show up, they execute, they move on. That's discipline. You don't need their permission to stay balanced. You don't need validation to remain steady. You have a choice. Detachment also protects energy. When you stop emotionally chasing outcomes, you stop wasting attention. Attention returns to process. Process creates results. This is why detachment accelerates progress. Emotion drains energy. Focus multiplies it. That's the key. Here's another truth most people avoid. People who manipulate emotionally need your attachment. They provoke, they withhold, they escalate, all to pull you back into reaction. Detachment breaks the hook. When you stop chasing emotional resolution, the game ends. You don't argue, you don't explain, you don't escalate. You disengage internally while remaining composed externally. That's power. You have a choice. Detachment also strengthens resilience. When outcomes don't define you, failure loses its sting. You learn faster, you recover quicker, you adapt better. Emotionally attached people break when plans fail. Detached people recalibrate. It's not about being cold, it's about being unbreakable. Say it clearly. It's not about apathy, it's about discipline. It's not about distance, it's about perspective. It's not about not caring, it's about caring without losing control. That's the key. Here's the daily practice. Do the work, release the outcome. Prepare thoroughly, detach emotionally. Show up fully, let results arrive without obsession. This is not passive, this is elite. You have a choice. Once detachment becomes natural, something changes. You stop reacting to noise. You stop chasing validation. You stop explaining yourself. And when that happens, something else takes its place: attention. You start to see clearly what actually matters. Because once you detach emotionally, you gain access to your most valuable resource. And that resource decides everything. You loosen detachment. Now you must master focus. Everything competes for your attention. And whatever wins, controls you. That's the key. Time passes whether you like it or not. Energy recovers if managed well. But attention, once wasted, is gone. You have a choice. Most people protect money more than attention. They track expenses but not focus. They guard wallets but not minds. That's why they stay reactive. Because attention fuels emotion. Where attention goes, emotion follows. Where emotion goes, behavior follows. And behavior creates outcomes. That's the chain. If you want to stay unbothered, you must become ruthless with attention. Not angry, not defensive, ruthless. You don't need their permission to ignore noise. You don't need approval to disengage mentally. You have a choice. Here's the truth most people miss. You are not reacting to people. You are reacting to where you placed attention. The insult only hurts if you listen. The drama only grows if you watch. The opinion only matters if you weigh it. That's the key. Attention is not neutral. It feeds. When you give attention to disrespect, you nourish it. When you give attention to negativity, you multiply it. When you give attention to comparison, you weaken yourself. This is why emotional people are loud. They want attention. And attention is currency. Most people spend it impulsively. They scroll, they argue, they consume outrage, they check reactions. Then they wonder why they feel anxious and distracted. It's not life, it's spending habits. You have a choice. Staying unbothered is less about thick skin and more about selective focus. You don't harden yourself, you starve distractions. That's the key. Here's the discipline. Before you react, ask, is this worth my attention? Not your emotion, not your opinion, your attention. If the answer is no, disengage immediately. No explanation, no announcement, no guilt. Attention withdrawn is power reclaimed. You don't need their permission to look away. You don't need validation to stop engaging. You have a choice. Here's how attention hijacks you. Something triggers emotion. Attention locks onto it. The mind loops. The body stays activated. Hours pass. Nothing changed except your state. That's expensive. Emotion drains energy. Rumination drains focus. Engagement drains clarity. Disciplined people don't argue with everything. They filter. They choose what deserves awareness. That's the key. Here are the biggest attention leaks. Online arguments, imaginary conversations, replaying disrespect, watching people you resent, consuming content that fuels anger. None of these improve your position. They only tax your system. You have a choice. Attention also determines self-respect. If you give focus to people who disrespect you, you teach yourself that you deserve it. If you give energy to low standards, you lower your own. Attention is identity training. That's the key. What you watch shapes what you tolerate. What you tolerate shapes who you become. So choose carefully. This doesn't mean isolation. It means intentional engagement. You still observe the world. You just don't emotionally invest in everything. You become a curator, not a consumer. You don't need their permission to disengage. You don't need agreement to protect focus. You have a choice. Here's the practical instruction. Every morning, decide 3 things that deserve your attention that day. Work, health, skill, progress. Then decide 3 things that don't. Drama, noise, validation seeking. This simple filter changes behavior. When distractions appear, you don't fight them, you ignore them. That's the key. Ignoring is not avoidance, it's prioritization. Your nervous system calms when attention is stable. Your mind sharpens when focus is protected. That's why unbothered people feel grounded. They are not pulled in 10 directions. They choose one. Here's another truth. People try harder to get attention from those who don't give it easily. That's human nature. But you don't do this to manipulate. You do it to protect your resources. Attention is not infinite. Spend it where it compounds. You have a choice. When attention is disciplined, emotional reactivity collapses. Why? Because emotion needs focus to survive. Starve it, and it fades. That's the key. You've learned to pause reactions. You've regulated the nervous system. You've released ego. You've detached from outcomes. Now you guard the gate. Because once attention is protected, something else becomes possible. Unpredictability. And unpredictability is dangerous to emotional manipulators. You control focus. Next, you break patterns.
Predictability is a weakness, not because people are evil, but because predictable reactions are easy to control. That's the key. When people know how you'll react, they know how to push you. They know what to say. They know what tone to use. They know where to press. You have a choice. Most people are emotionally readable. Anger shows fast. Defensiveness appears instantly. Ego flares on schedule. That makes them easy. Easy to provoke. Easy to distract. Easy to manipulate. Emotional control breaks that pattern. When reactions stop following expectation, control shifts back to you. That's the key. Unpredictability doesn't mean chaos. It means non-reactivity. It means you no longer respond on impulse. You respond on decision. That difference changes everything. You don't need their permission to pause. You don't need approval to respond differently. You have a choice. Here's the truth. People don't fear anger. They understand anger. People don't fear sadness. They recognize sadness. What unsettles them is calm where emotion was expected. Calm breaks scripts. Someone insults you. They expect defense. You stay neutral. Script broken. Someone provokes. They expect escalation. You remain composed. Script broken. That moment of confusion is power. That's the key. Emotional people rely on patterns. They push until they get reaction. When reaction doesn't arrive, they lose leverage. This is why emotional manipulators increase intensity when you stop reacting. They raise volume. They exaggerate. They accuse. They are searching for the old pattern. Don't give it. You have a choice. Unpredictability comes from internal consistency, not random behavior. You are not erratic, you are grounded. You don't swing emotionally, you remain stable. That stability makes reactions hard to forecast. Here's how you train it. Stop responding the same way to the same trigger. Same insult, different response. Same pressure, slower pace. Same provocation, less engagement. Not to confuse others, to free yourself. That's the key. Most people are predictable because they are emotional. Emotion narrows options. Discipline expands them. When emotion is low, choices increase. You see more angles. You choose timing. You decide whether to engage at all. You have a choice. Here's the discipline that scares emotional people. Delayed response. When you don't answer immediately, you control the frame. Urgency disappears, pressure fades, and the other person starts revealing intent. They speak more, they justify, they over-explain. Silence combined with delay is powerful. Not cold, not hostile, controlled. That's the key. Unpredictability also protects energy. When you stop being reactive, fewer people test you. They sense resistance without confrontation. They move on to easier targets. This is not theory, it's human behavior. People seek reactions like fuel. No fuel, no fire. You have a choice. But understand this clearly. Unpredictability is not a performance. It's a byproduct of discipline. You don't act mysterious. You become regulated. You don't hide emotion. You stop being ruled by it. That's the difference. Here's a practical rule. Never respond emotionally to emotional behavior. If someone is loud, you go quiet. If someone is rushed, you slow down. If someone is reactive, you remain still. Opposites disrupt patterns. That's the key. This is not submission, it's control. You set the emotional temperature. Most people mirror emotion unconsciously. Disciplined people lead it. You have a choice. Once people realize they can't predict your reactions, respect changes. Not because you demanded it, but because you stopped giving away leverage. They don't know what will work anymore. And that uncertainty creates caution. Caution creates space. Space creates authority. That's the chain. Here's the final truth of this chapter. The most powerful response is the one no one saw coming. Not louder, not harsher, calmer. You have learned to pause. You have learned to regulate. You have learned to protect attention. Now you learn to remove the last hook emotional people use, the need for closure. Because as long as you chase closure, you remain reactive. You broke the pattern, now you end the cycle.
Closure is overrated. Not because endings don't matter, but because most people chase closure for the wrong reason. They don't want understanding. They want emotional relief. That's the key. Closure is often just a polite word for validation, an explanation, an apology, a final conversation that makes things feel fair. But fairness does not create peace. Control does. You have a choice. Most people stay emotionally stuck because they believe something is unfinished. They replay conversations. They imagine what they should have said. They wait for accountability that never comes. And while they wait, their nervous system stays activated. That's expensive. Here's the truth most people avoid. The mind doesn't need closure to move on. It needs direction. Closure looks backward. Control looks forward. That's the key. When you seek closure, you hand power to someone else. You say, I can't be at peace until you explain. I can't move on until you understand. I can't let go until this makes sense. That's not strength, that's dependency. You don't need their permission to be at peace. You don't need their explanation to regain control. You have a choice. Here's why closure rarely works. Even when you get it, it fades. The apology doesn't heal what you hoped it would. The explanation doesn't satisfy. The conversation opens new questions. Because the nervous system doesn't calm through words, it calms through finality of behavior. That's the key. People think closure is a conversation. It's not. Closure is a decision to stop engaging emotionally, a decision to stop replaying, a decision to stop waiting. You don't need answers. You need boundaries. You have a choice. Here's the pattern. Something ends badly. Emotion spikes. The mind looks for meaning. So it reaches outward. Texts, calls, confrontations, internal debates. All of it keeps the wound active. Why? Because attention stays attached. That's the key. Attention keeps emotion alive. Control removes it. Here's the discipline. When you feel the urge to get closure, pause. Ask one question. What behavior would actually bring peace right now? Not words, not explanations, behavior. Distance, silence, focus shift, routine. That's where healing happens. You have a choice. Control means deciding what you engage with and what you don't. You don't owe everyone resolution. You don't need to understand everyone to move forward. Understanding is optional. Discipline is not. That's the key. Here's another truth most people miss. The need for closure is often ego in disguise. Ego wants to be right, to be acknowledged, to be seen as justified. Control doesn't need recognition. It moves on quietly. You don't need their permission to disengage. You don't need agreement to let go. You have a choice. High-level people don't chase emotional resolution. They accept uncertainty and redirect energy. They don't say, I need to understand. They say, I need to proceed. That mindset builds momentum. Momentum dissolves emotional attachment. That's the key. Here's a practical instruction. When something ends without clarity, create artificial closure. Not through fantasy, through structure. Decide, this chapter is closed. Then back it up with action. Delete the thread, stop checking, change routines, refocus attention. Your nervous system responds to action, not intention. Say it again clearly. Your nervous system responds to action, not intention. This is why people stay stuck even after deciding to move on. They keep behaving the same. Same checks, same thoughts, same loops. Control requires behavior change. You have a choice. Closure says, once this is resolved, I'll be okay. Control says, I'll be okay regardless. That's power. And power is calm. Here's the final truth of this chapter. Nothing outside you needs to change for you to regain control. Not their understanding, not their apology, not their explanation. Your discipline is enough. You stopped chasing reactions. You stopped feeding ego. You stopped leaking attention. Now you stop waiting for permission to move forward. Because once control replaces closure, something happens. You stop explaining yourself. You stop justifying decisions. You stop engaging with people who don't qualify. You don't look back. You move cleanly. You've removed the need for emotional resolution. Now you remove the need to convince. Because explaining yourself is another form of reaction. You took control. Now you speak less.
Explanation is a habit, not a requirement. Most people explain themselves not because it's necessary, but because they feel uncomfortable being misunderstood. That discomfort is emotional. That's the key. When you explain yourself to emotional people, you are not clarifying truth. You are negotiating feelings. And feelings are never satisfied by logic. You have a choice. Emotional people don't want understanding. They want relief. Relief from insecurity. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from not being in control. So they pull you into conversation. They ask questions that aren't questions. They accuse disguised as curiosity. They challenge disguised as concern. And if you explain, you lose. Because explanations invite debate. Debate invites emotion. Emotion invites reaction. That's the cycle. You don't need their permission to stop explaining. You don't need approval to remain brief. You have a choice. Here's the truth most people resist. If someone is emotional, your explanation will not calm them. It will activate them. They will twist words. They will interrupt. They will escalate. Because emotional people listen to respond, not to understand. That's the key. Explanation works with rational minds. It fails with emotional ones. And most conflicts are emotional, not logical. So stop treating them like logic problems. Strong people know when explanation is productive and when it's pointless. They don't over-communicate. They under-respond. That's power. You have a choice. Here's how explaining yourself weakens you. First, it signals insecurity. When you explain excessively, you say, I need you to see me a certain way. That hands control to perception. Second, it invites disrespect. The more you justify, the more others feel entitled to judge. Third, it drains energy. Every explanation is emotional labor, and emotional labor compounds fatigue. That's the key. Disciplined people do not argue their boundaries, they enforce them. They don't debate decisions, they execute them.
They don't convince, they move. You don't need their permission to act in alignment with your values. You don't need validation to choose silence. You have a choice. Here's a reality check. People who respect you don't require explanations. People who don't respect you won't accept them anyway. So who are explanations for? Ego. Ego wants to be understood. Ego wants to be seen as reasonable. Ego wants to avoid being judged. Control doesn't need any of that. That's the key. Let's be clear. This is not about being rude. This is not about being dismissive. This is about not feeding emotional loops. You can be polite and brief, calm and firm, clear without detail. That's discipline. Here's what it looks like in practice. Instead of explaining your entire reasoning, you say, "I've made my decision." Instead of defending your boundary, you say, "That doesn't work for me." Instead of justifying your silence, you say nothing. These statements are complete. They don't invite debate. They don't provoke escalation. They close loops. That's the key. Emotional people hate closed loops. They want access. They want engagement. They want reaction. When you don't give it, they feel powerless. And powerless people often escalate. That's when discipline matters most. You have a choice. When escalation happens, don't match intensity. Stay neutral. Volume low, words minimal, tone steady. Never explain during emotional intensity. Never. Explanation during emotion trains people to use emotion to access you. That's dangerous. Say it clearly. Never reward emotional pressure with explanation. That's the rule. You are teaching people how to treat you with every response. Teach them that emotion gets nothing. Teach them that calm gets clarity. That's the key. Here's another truth most people avoid. Over-explaining is often fear of losing connection. You think if you don't explain, the relationship will suffer. But relationships built on emotional negotiation are fragile. They require constant maintenance. Strong relationships respect boundaries without explanation. They don't need constant reassurance. You have a choice. Here's a practical discipline. Before you explain anything, ask, is this explanation necessary or am I trying to manage perception? If it's about perception, stop. Perception is not your responsibility. Behavior is. You control actions. You don't control interpretation. That's the key. Once you stop explaining, something shifts. People either adjust or they leave. Both outcomes are useful. Those who adjust respect you more. Those who leave were feeding off access. Either way, you gain clarity. And clarity is power. You don't need their permission to simplify communication. You don't need approval to say less. You have a choice. This chapter is about restraint. Restraint of words, restraint of justification, restraint of emotional labor. Because every word you don't say preserves authority. Silence plus boundaries is unstoppable. You have removed the need for closure. You have stopped explaining yourself. Now you arrive at a higher level. A level where identity is no longer tied to emotion. Because once explanations stop, something else begins. Identity shifts, and when identity shifts, pain loses relevance. You've stopped feeding emotional people. Now you redefine who you are beyond reaction. You learned when to stay silent. Now you change what can hurt you at all.
Pain does not come from events. It comes from identity. That's the key. Two people experience the same situation. One collapses, one remains steady. The difference is not toughness. It's who they believe they are. You have a choice. Most emotional pain exists because identity is narrow. When identity is small, everything feels personal. When identity is fragile, everything feels threatening. When identity is rigid, change feels painful. That's the trap. People don't suffer because things happen. They suffer because events collide with how they see themselves. You don't need their permission to redefine yourself. You don't need approval to evolve. You have a choice. Let's make this clear. If your identity is, "I need to be respected," then disrespect hurts deeply. If your identity is, "I need to be understood," then misunderstanding feels unbearable. If your identity is, "I need to be valued," then indifference feels like rejection. That's not strength, that's dependency. That's the key. Identity acts like a target. The smaller it is, the easier it is to hit. When identity expands, pain loses precision. You still feel emotion, but it doesn't penetrate as deeply. It passes through. Strong people don't feel less pain because they're numb. They feel less pain because less threatens who they are. You have a choice. Most people build identity around roles: employee, partner, friend, leader, victim. Roles are fragile. They depend on others. They shift, they end. When identity is role-based, pain is guaranteed. Because roles can be challenged, removed, or misunderstood. That's the key. Disciplined people build identity around principles: discipline, consistency, self-respect, growth, control. Principles are internal. They don't require validation. They don't depend on outcomes. When identity is principle-based, emotional pain shrinks because no one can take principles from you. You have a choice. Here's the mistake most people make. They try to change emotions directly. They say, "I shouldn't feel this way. I need to be stronger. I need thicker skin." That doesn't work. Emotion is a symptom. Identity is the cause. Change identity and emotion follows. That's the key. Here's how identity gets stuck. You repeat a story about yourself. "I'm the kind of person who," "I've always been someone who," "This is just how I am." Those stories harden. Then, when life challenges them, pain appears. Not because life is cruel, but because identity is outdated. You have a choice. Growth requires identity updates. Who you were 5 years ago cannot handle who you are becoming, so pain appears not to punish you, but to force expansion. That's a different way to see it. Pain is not the enemy. Clinging is. You don't need their permission to outgrow old versions of yourself. You don't need agreement to change. You have a choice. Here's the discipline. When emotional pain appears, don't ask, "How do I make this stop?" Ask, "What identity is being challenged right now?" Is it the identity of being liked, being right, being needed, being admired? That question removes confusion. Once you see the identity, you loosen it. You say, "I am not that role. I am not that image. I am not that moment." That's the key. You replace it with something stronger, not an affirmation, a standard. I am someone who controls response. I am someone who protects attention. I am someone who adapts and moves forward. Standards are durable. They don't collapse under pressure. You have a choice. Here's another truth most people avoid. When identity upgrades, some relationships suffer. People who knew the old you feel uncomfortable. They test boundaries. They provoke. Not because you changed for the worse, but because access changed. That's normal. Don't explain it. Don't justify it. Let identity shift silently. That's power. You don't need their permission to redefine yourself. You don't need approval to evolve. You have a choice. As identity expands, emotional pain loses leverage. Criticism feels lighter. Rejection feels informational. Loss feels temporary because nothing threatens your core. You become internally referenced. That's the goal.
Externally referenced people live reactive lives. Internally referenced people live disciplined ones. That's the key. Here's the final instruction for this chapter. Stop asking, how do I protect myself from pain? Start asking, how do I build an identity pain can't control? The answer is discipline, consistency, standards over stories. You don't harden yourself, you outgrow vulnerability to trivial pain. And once identity shifts, something powerful happens. Calm becomes natural, reaction feels unnecessary, respect increases without demand. You have changed who you are. Now you learn how to use that calm as leverage, because calm is not just peace, calm is advantage. You reshaped identity. Next, you turn calm into authority.
Here is the truth you can no longer ignore. The world isn't attacking you. You are reacting to it. And every reaction trains weakness. Every pause trains power. Staying unbothered is not avoidance, it's mastery. It's emotional discipline so deep that chaos can stand in front of you and get nothing. From this moment forward, you don't rush responses. You don't explain emotions. You don't feed disrespect with attention. Your challenge is simple, but not easy. For the next 30 days, pause before every reaction. Breathe, observe, choose control. Because the moment you stop reacting, you start leading.